The empty uniform was the first insult. It hung on a wooden chair beside the ring, white jacket folded perfectly, belt laid across it like a challenge waiting for a body. The officials had placed it there before Bruce Lee arrived. They thought they were offering respect. What they were really offering was permission to be accepted. The hall was a converted civic gymnasium with high windows, basketball lines still visible beneath the tournament mats, and a row of flags taped badly to the back wall. This was not a glamorous place. It was a practical room full of serious men who believed practical rooms needed practical rules. On that afternoon, the most important rule was simple: wear the uniform. Every school had obeyed. Karate students stood in white GIs. Judo men wore heavier jackets. Some kung fu practitioners wore traditional jackets with frog buttons. Judges wore dark suits. Even the audience seemed dressed for order. Belts, patches, collars, ranks, and school colors told everyone where a man belonged before he opened his mouth. That was the comfort of the room. It believed identity should be visible. It believed discipline could be recognized from across the floor. It believed respect had a shape, and that shape could be stitched, tied, and inspected. The men running the event did not think of this as arrogance. They thought of it as standards. Bruce Lee entered through a side door wearing simple dark clothes. No school patch, no formal jacket, no visible belt. No attempt to apologize for the absence. The conversation near the registration table faded first. Then the voices around the ring followed. Nothing dramatic happened. That was why everyone noticed. He carried himself like a man already dressed. That bothered people more than if he had acted rebellious. A rebel announces that he needs your reaction. Bruce did not ask for reaction. He walked in calmly, greeted the host, and looked toward the ring as if the question of cloth had already been answered inside him. The chief official was named Edwin Clark in this story, a fictional organizer with a careful mustache, polished shoes, and the exhausted dignity of a man trying to keep martial artists from turning a showcase into a feud. He saw Bruce, then saw the empty uniform on the chair, then saw 3 senior instructors watching his face for weakness. Clark cleared his throat. "Mr. Lee," he said, "we prepared proper attire." He gestured toward the chair. The room waited. Bruce looked at the folded uniform, then back at Clark. "Proper for what?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it reached every man who believed the answer should have been obvious. Clark's smile tightened. "For the ring." Bruce nodded once, as if considering the idea honestly. "The ring does not know what I am wearing," he said. The line landed without humor. Some students smiled anyway, then stopped when they noticed their teachers were not smiling. A senior instructor named Warren Pike stepped forward. Pike was a respected karate man, broad through the chest, hard-faced, and deeply convinced that tradition survived through visible discipline. "Uniform shows respect," he said. Bruce turned toward him. "Sometime," he answered. "Sometimes it shows only that a man knows how to dress." That answer made the room colder. Not because it was loud, because it refused the lazy version of agreement. Bruce was not mocking uniforms. He was refusing to let clothing become the full measure of respect. Adults in the room understood the difference. Proud men often do not. Pike looked at Bruce's dark shirt, then at the folded white jacket. "So you think rules are beneath you?" Bruce shook his head. "No. I think rules should serve the purpose. If the purpose is respect, let us see respect. If the purpose is fighting, let us see fighting." The host tried to move the conversation back into safety. He explained that the showcase had structure, that the audience expected order, that each school would demonstrate within recognizable forms. Bruce listened without interrupting. That patience mattered. He was not a child refusing discipline. He was a man asking whether discipline had become decoration. Pike's students stood behind him, white uniforms, crisp and identical. One of them whispered that Bruce looked like he had wandered in from the street. Pike heard it and did not correct him. That silence revealed the room better than any insult. The uniform had become a wall, and Bruce stood on the wrong side of it. Bruce looked at the students, not harshly. "A man can wear a clean jacket and still bring a dirty intention," he said. The line did not accuse anyone directly. That made it harder to reject. Several fathers in the audience shifted in their seats. They had heard versions of that truth outside martial arts. Clark asked if Bruce would at least wear the jacket for the demonstration. Bruce glanced at it again. "If I wear it to make them comfortable," he said, "am I showing respect or am I helping them avoid the question?" The room did not answer because the question had already found the weak place. Warren Pike stepped closer to the ring. "Then answer the question on the mat," he said. The event had not planned a challenge, but pride rarely waits for a printed schedule. Bruce looked at Clark. Clark looked at the audience. The audience looked at the uniform on the chair. Bruce did not remove his shirt. He did not change his clothes. He did not perform rebellion. He simply stepped toward the ring in exactly what he had worn through the door. That small refusal carried more weight than a speech. A man who respects himself does not need permission to stand in his own skin. Pike entered from the opposite side in full uniform. Everything about him looked official. The belt, the patch, the posture, the sharp bow, the clean line of the sleeves. He represented the room's idea of order. Bruce represented something more unsettling. Order that did not need the room's costume. They bowed. Pike's bow was technically perfect. Bruce's was complete and quiet. That difference mattered. The older men noticed. A bow can be correct without being sincere, and simple without being careless. The room began to understand that the issue was not uniform versus no uniform. It was visible respect versus lived respect. Pike raised his guard. Bruce stood relaxed. Someone near the back whispered that he looked unprepared. Another man answered, "Maybe that is the point." The exchange had not started, yet the room was already divided between what it recognized and what it could not yet read. Pike attacked with a straight punch, clean and heavy. Bruce shifted outside it, touching the forearm just enough to change the line. His other hand stopped near Pike's ribs, then withdrew. No damage. No humiliation. Just information placed where arrogance had expected emptiness. Pike reset. His face did not show fear, but it showed adjustment. He had felt Bruce's timing. The dark clothes no longer looked casual in quite the same way. They looked quiet. That is a dangerous change in a room that had mistaken quiet for disrespect. He attacked again with a kick, sharper this time, meant to force Bruce into a retreat. Bruce entered instead. He moved into the space where the kick had not yet become powerful, and Pike found himself too extended, too late, too dressed for an answer that had already changed. The audience made a small sound. Bruce held Pike's sleeve lightly to keep him from stumbling off the mat. That detail traveled through the room. He had corrected the attack and protected the attacker. Respect was no longer sitting folded on the chair. It was happening in motion. Pike pulled his arm free, more from embarrassment than anger. Bruce let him. A lesser man might have tightened the grip to make a point. Bruce did not need that. When a point has landed, pressing harder often turns truth into ego. Clark stepped forward as if to stop the exchange, but Pike shook his head. "Continue," he said. The word had less pride now and more need. He needed to understand whether the first two moments were accidents. A serious man can become useful the moment he chooses understanding over image. Bruce nodded. "One honest exchange," he said. Pike's eyes changed. The phrase touched him. It did not mock his uniform. It asked whether the man inside it was ready to meet the moment without hiding behind the symbol. Pike attacked with his best rhythm: punch, low kick, second punch, step to pressure. He was skilled. This mattered. The story would be empty if the uniformed man were a fool. Pike was not a fool. He was a disciplined man whose discipline had become too attached to being seen. Bruce answered with small movements. A shoulder angle, a wrist touch, a step that made Pike's second punch arrive at an empty address. The final stop came at Pike's chest, palm open, controlled, unmistakable. Pike looked down at the hand and breathed once through his nose. For a second, nobody moved. The uniform had done everything it could do. The man inside it now had to answer. Pike lowered his hands. That choice was more important than the exchange. He could have demanded another round. He could have blamed clothing, rules, or surprise. Instead, he stood still. Bruce stepped back first. That gave Pike dignity. Adult men noticed that kind of gesture. Bruce had proven the point without standing on top of it. He had not entered without a uniform because he lacked respect. He had entered that way to show the room where respect actually lived. Pike looked toward the chair where the empty white jacket still waited. Then he looked at his own sleeves. The room watched him carefully. A proud man can hear the truth and still choose to defend the costume. Pike's face showed the fight happening inside him. One of Pike's students whispered, "Sensei?" It was not a challenge. It was fear. Students fear the moment their teacher's image changes. They do not yet know that a teacher can become stronger when the image becomes more honest. Pike turned toward the student. "Stand straight," he said, but the voice was not cruel. It was almost protective. Then he turned back to Bruce. "You made your point," he said. Bruce answered, "No, the point is yours now." That line made Pike uncomfortable. Winning an exchange is easier than handing a man responsibility for what it means. Bruce had not come to collect a trophy from Pike's pride. He had put a mirror in front of him and stepped aside. Clark asked whether they could continue the program. Pike raised one hand. "Wait." The room stiffened again. Pike walked to the chair, picked up the folded uniform jacket, and held it. For a moment, some believed he would offer it to Bruce again. Instead, he turned toward his students. "This jacket matters," Pike said. His students relaxed. Then he continued, "But it does not matter more than the man wearing it." The relaxation disappeared and became a tension. Pike looked older as he spoke, but also more useful. A man's authority deepens when he stops protecting it from truth. Bruce listened without expression. He did not need Pike to praise him. He needed the room to move 1 inch closer to honesty. Pike held the jacket tighter. "If your respect ends when another man dresses differently," Pike said, "then your respect was never discipline. It was comfort." The audience heard the weight in those words. They were not Bruce's words. That made them stronger. A lesson becomes real when the corrected man can speak it in his own voice. Pike had not become Bruce's follower. He had become more responsible for his own tradition. A few students looked confused. That was fine. Confusion is often the first honest state after certainty breaks. Pike placed the jacket back on the chair, but not as an insult now. It became what it should have been from the beginning, a tool, not a throne. Clark exhaled for the first time in several minutes. The event could continue, but everyone knew it would not continue in the same way. The ring had changed, not physically. The tape lines were the same. The chairs were the same, but the room's measurement of respect had shifted. Bruce picked up his own jacket from the side and put it over his arm. A young student approached him hesitantly and asked, "Should uniforms not matter?" Bruce looked at the boy carefully. "They can matter," he said, "but they must remind you to be disciplined, not convince you that you already are." The boy nodded, not fully understanding yet. That was all right. Some lessons arrive before a student is old enough to open them. Years later, that sentence might return when he saw a man use symbols to avoid character. The showcase resumed. The next school performed in perfect uniforms, and somehow the uniforms looked better than before. Not more powerful, not more sacred, just more honest. When a symbol is returned to its proper size, it can become useful again. Pike's students performed after that. Their stances were clean, their bows sharp, but their faces had changed. They were no longer performing certainty for their teacher. They were trying to live up to the heavier version of discipline he had just placed in front of them. That is how a room matures, not by throwing away every symbol and not by worshiping every symbol. It matures when it learns what the symbol is for. A belt should remind a man to carry himself better. A uniform should remind him to train honestly. Neither should become a hiding place. Bruce sat near the back during the next demonstration. He did not look pleased with himself. That restraint mattered. He had been challenged, tested, and proven right in public, but he did not consume the room's attention afterward. Self-respect does not need to keep feeding on a victory. Pike approached him quietly during a break. No audience circle formed around them, no dramatic apology, just two men beside a stack of folding chairs. Pike said, "I mistook the sign for the substance." Bruce nodded. "Many men do. The sign is easier to polish." Pike looked down at his belt. "And the substance?" Bruce answered, "Harder to keep clean." That line stayed with Pike because it did not flatter him. It gave him work. A polished belt could be inspected in a mirror. A clean intention had to be inspected under pressure. Clark joined them, relieved and still nervous. "You almost broke the event," he said. Bruce smiled faintly. "Maybe it needed a crack." Clark did not know whether to laugh. Pike did. Not loudly, but enough to show that some part of the earlier stiffness had loosened. The afternoon continued into evening. Demonstrations of weapons, throws, forms, and sparring filled the schedule. But the image everyone kept returning to was not the biggest kick or the loudest board break. It was Bruce stepping into the ring dressed as himself, while a prepared uniform sat unused beside him. That image worked because every adult in the room knew a version of it. The meeting where clothing mattered more than competence. The title that mattered more than conduct. The badge, office, uniform, watch, car, or reputation that allowed a man to borrow dignity instead of building it. Bruce did not reject appearance because appearance means nothing. Appearance can show care. It can show discipline. It can show respect for a shared space. But appearance becomes dangerous when it is used to avoid the harder question, what kind of man is standing inside it? That was the question Pike had been forced to face. His uniform was real. His training was real. His skill was real. But the exchange revealed that he had allowed the uniform to speak before his character did. Bruce simply made the order correct again. This is why the story should remain grounded. No mysticism is needed. No secret power. No magical aura. A man walked into a room dressed simply. Proud men judged him. He tested the judgment under pressure. Then the strongest lesson came not from the strike, but from what the judged men did afterward. Pike could have become small. He did not. He accepted enough truth to teach his students better. That is masculine dignity in a serious sense, not never being corrected, but refusing to let correction turn into resentment. He kept his spine and changed his mind. Bruce represented the standard that made that possible. He did not beg for acceptance. He did not scream against the rule. He entered calmly, tested cleanly, and left the room with its dignity still available. Strong men do not need to destroy every room that misunderstands them. A younger instructor later asked Clark whether the uniform rule would remain. Clark said yes. That surprised him. Then Clark added, "But no one will pretend it answers everything." That was the right result. The rule survived, but the superstition around it weakened. The difference matters. Destroying the rule would have been an easy dramatic ending. Keeping the rule in its proper place was more adult. It admitted that order has value without letting order become cowardice. Bruce's influence often worked that way, not replacing one extreme with another, but forcing the middle to become honest. Near the end of the event, Pike's young student approached the chair with the folded jacket. He touched the sleeve, then looked toward Bruce across the room. The boy was not rejecting the uniform. He was seeing it differently. That small shift was the future of the lesson. When Pike called his students together, he did not lecture long. Dress correctly, he told them. Train correctly, but never let the first convince you the second has happened. The students stood straighter. Some understood. Some would understand later. That is how good teaching often works. Bruce left before the final photographs. That detail annoyed the host but preserved the meaning. If he had stayed in the center, the event might have become about him. Leaving allowed the room to own what had happened. A lesson matures when the teacher is no longer standing beside it. Outside, the evening air was cool. Bruce walked past the parking lot, still in the same clothes he had worn into the ring. Nothing about him looked victorious in the cheap way. No trophy, no applause following him. Just a man who had refused to let other men dress his dignity for him. Inside, Pike stood for the final group photograph in full uniform. This time the uniform looked different on him. Not lighter, heavier. Symbols become heavier when a man understands what they demand. A belt is easy to tie. It is harder to become worthy of tying it every day. The photograph from that evening circulated in small circles. People pointed out Bruce's dark clothes first. That was the hook. But those who understood the story pointed to Pike's face later in the evening. Less stiff, more thoughtful, a little less certain in the best possible way. A man who is less certain can become more disciplined if he does not panic. Certainty is comfortable, but discipline is deeper. Certainty says, I already know what respect looks like. Discipline says, I will keep testing whether my respect is real. That is why Bruce Lee's refusal to wear the prepared uniform mattered. It was not childish rebellion. It was a test of whether the room could separate respect from costume. Some failed at first. Pike nearly failed completely, but the room recovered enough to learn. For adult viewers, this is the emotional center. Every man knows the pressure to wear what a room expects. The attitude, the role, the silence, the smile, the apology, the false agreement. Sometimes maturity means adapting. Sometimes dignity means refusing to costume yourself as someone easier for others to accept. Bruce's refusal was powerful because it was not noisy. He did not make a speech about individuality. He simply stood where he was and allowed the truth to be tested. A man who knows himself does not need to argue with every misunderstanding. He needs only the courage to meet the moment cleanly. Pike's growth was equally important. He started as the man defending the costume. He ended as the man explaining its proper place. That arc gives the story its strength. Without Pike's change, the episode would be only a clash. With his change, it becomes a lesson about manhood. Manhood here does not mean domination. It means the ability to hold form without becoming trapped in form, to respect tradition without hiding behind tradition, to be corrected without collapsing, to stand in front of students and admit, not with weakness, but with authority, that the symbol is not the substance. Bruce gave Pike that chance by not humiliating him too deeply. He could have. The exchange allowed it. The room expected it, but he stopped short, helped him keep balance, and let the lesson enter through dignity rather than through destruction. That is the difference between a fighter and a standard. A fighter can beat a man. A standard can make a man measure himself. Bruce became the standard in that room not because he wore the right thing, but because his conduct forced everyone else to reconsider what right meant. The empty uniform on the chair remained the perfect image. At first it looked like order waiting for Bruce to obey. By the end, it looked like a question waiting for the room to grow up. What is respect when no one can inspect it from across the floor? The answer had been shown, not preached. Respect was in the complete bow, in the controlled stop, in the hand holding Pike's sleeve so he would not fall, in Bruce stepping back after making his point, in Pike admitting the jacket mattered, but not more than the man wearing it. That is why the story has retention. It keeps changing the object of attention. First the uniform, then the insult, then the exchange, then the student watching, then Pike's choice, then the symbol returning to its proper size. Each turn adds pressure without needing empty talk. Empty talk would ruin this story. The audience does not need lectures about clothing. They need to feel what happens when a proud room mistakes appearance for worth. They need to watch a man refuse the costume, not because he lacks respect, but because his respect is already inside his conduct. That is the adult version of the lesson. Children argue uniforms versus no uniforms. Men ask what the uniform is supposed to produce. If it produces discipline, good. If it produces arrogance, examine it. If it becomes a shield against truth, the shield has become the opponent. Bruce Lee walked into the ring without a uniform and changed the rules because he changed what the rule was required to prove. Before him, the rule proved belonging. After him, the rule had to serve behavior. That is a much higher standard. Warren Pike kept wearing his uniform. That matters. The story does not end with him throwing it away. He kept it because it still had value. But after that day, at least in this story, he wore it with less entitlement and more responsibility. His students noticed. Young men always notice when a teacher's authority changes texture. They may not have words for it, but they feel when command becomes more honest. Pike corrected them more carefully afterward. He cared less about whether their collars were perfect if their intention was sloppy. He still corrected the collars. That is the important part. Discipline did not vanish. It deepened. A serious man can care about both the collar and the intention, but he must know which one leads. The visible thing should serve the invisible thing. Bruce understood that principle beyond uniforms. A stance should serve movement. A style should serve expression. A title should serve responsibility. A reputation should serve conduct. When the servant becomes the master, the man begins performing life instead of living it. That is why the event stayed in memory. It was not the hardest fight. It was not the most violent challenge. It was a clean adult conflict over symbols, pride, and substance. Those conflicts follow men everywhere, in offices, families, gyms, schools, and every place where appearance can borrow authority. Bruce did not reject the world's symbols. He refused to be ruled by them. That is a subtle difference, and it is the difference that makes the story strong. A childish rebel hates the uniform because it is a uniform. A mature man asks whether the uniform still serves the truth. Pike learned that question in public. Public learning is heavy. It presses on the face, the hands, the voice. But he carried it. He did not carry it perfectly. No man does. He carried it well enough to turn the moment into teaching. The host, Clark, later wrote a note in the event records. Attire policy reviewed. It sounded boring, almost comic compared with what had happened. But maybe that was fitting. Big lessons often leave small paperwork behind. The true record was in the way men looked at the chair afterward. The chair had held a uniform. Then it held a question. Then it held a lesson. By the end, it held nothing but folded cloth again, and yet everyone who passed it understood that cloth differently. That is how a symbol changes without moving. Bruce's dark clothes did not make him better. That would be another shallow conclusion. They simply removed one familiar category from the room. Without the category, the room had to look at movement, conduct, timing, restraint, and dignity. It had to look at the man. That is what strong storytelling should do too. Remove the easy category. Force the viewer to look at the man. Not the myth, not the costume, not the poster, not the legend as decoration. The man under pressure, the man choosing control, the man leaving dignity available for others. In that sense, Bruce Lee becomes a symbol without becoming mystical. He represents a kind of masculine self-command that does not need permission from the room. He can bow completely without surrendering himself. He can challenge a rule without becoming childish. He can win without needing another man destroyed. That balance is rare. Many men can obey. Many men can rebel. Fewer can stand between obedience and rebellion and ask the harder question, what serves truth right now? Bruce asked that with his clothes, his movement, and his restraint. The answer changed the rules because it changed the standard. A uniform could still be required. A bow could still matter. A belt could still be respected. But none of them could be allowed to replace the discipline they were supposed to remind people to practice. That is why the final image should be quiet. The folded uniform on the chair after the room is empty, stage lights dimming, tape lines on the mat, and the sense that a simple piece of cloth had been forced to give up pretending it was character. A piece of cloth can be cleaned. Character has to be tested. That was the lesson Bruce Lee brought into the ring without wearing the uniform they had prepared for him. He did not reject respect. He demanded a stronger version of it. And when the room finally understood that, the rule did not disappear. It became heavier, better, more honest. A real rule should not make men smaller. It should ask them to become more worthy of the thing they claim to represent. Bruce left them with that standard. Clark had to run a better event. Pike had to teach better students. The young boy had to remember that discipline is not stitched into a jacket. And the audience had to admit that sometimes the man outside the expected uniform is the one most clearly dressed in self-respect. The story still works because everyone has seen the opposite. Men dressed correctly and acting poorly, men with titles and no honor, men with authority and no control. Bruce's entrance challenged that old lie in one glance. The exchange proved it. Pike's response completed it. So when people say Bruce Lee walked into the ring without a uniform and changed the rules, the deeper meaning is this. He did not change the clothing policy first. He changed the room's understanding of what the clothing was supposed to mean. That is more powerful than rebellion. Rebellion can become another costume. Bruce did not trade one costume for another. He stood as himself, tested the room's judgment, and forced the symbol to become honest again. That is a story adults can respect, because adults know the world is full of uniforms. Some are made of cloth, some are made of language, rank, success, wealth, age, reputation, or tradition. The danger is the same. A man begins believing the uniform is proof, when it should only be a reminder. The reminder is simple. Be worthy of what you wear. Be worthy of what you claim. Be worthy of the bow, the belt, the title, the room, the students watching you. If you are not, the cleanest jacket in the world cannot protect you from the truth. Bruce Lee did not need the white jacket on the chair to show respect. His respect was visible in how he moved, how he stopped, how he corrected, and how he left Pike standing. That is why the room remembered him. The white jacket stayed behind. The lesson walked out with every serious man who understood it. Some viewers may think the story is about clothing. It is not. Clothing is only the doorway. The real story is about men who let symbols do too much work for them. Bruce refused that arrangement. He forced the work back where it belonged, into behavior, control, restraint, and courage. That is why Pike's transformation matters as much as Bruce's victory. Pike begins as the defender of the visible rule. He ends as a man mature enough to say the rule must serve something deeper. That arc keeps the story from becoming empty rebellion. A lesser version would make uniforms look foolish. This version does not. It makes false confidence look foolish. It makes shallow judgment look foolish. It makes the room grow up without asking it to throw away discipline. That is the tone we need. Grounded, adult, respectful, but sharp. Bruce's strength is not that he walks in different clothes. Anyone can do that. His strength is that he can walk in different clothes and still behave with more respect than the men accusing him of disrespect. That contrast is the entire hook turned into character. The men who watched understood something they could use outside martial arts. Do not confuse presentation with substance. Do not confuse tradition with character. Do not confuse belonging with worth. A man can be properly dressed and still be empty. A man can look simple and still carry a standard. That standard is why Bruce Lee remains useful as a symbol. He is not floating above men. He is not magic. He is a picture of self-command under judgment. He enters a room already doubted, does not beg to be understood, and lets conduct answer what appearance could not. By the end, the prepared uniform was no longer an invitation for Bruce to become acceptable. It had become an invitation for everyone else to ask whether they were worthy of what they wore. That is a stronger ending than simply winning a fight. And that is the final lesson of the ring without a uniform. The strongest man in the room is not always the one wearing the clearest symbol. Sometimes it is the one who can stand without the symbol and still make the symbol mean more when he leaves. Bruce Lee changed the rules because he changed the measurement. Before him, the room measured respect by appearance first. After him, it had to measure respect by conduct under pressure. That is a harder standard and a better one. The uniform remained. The excuse did not. The civic gym did not need a louder ending. It needed a truer one. The mats could be rolled up, the chairs stacked, the uniforms packed into bags, and still the question would remain. When the visible sign is removed, what is left of the man? Bruce had forced the room to answer without decoration. That is why the episode should not be played as rebellion for rebellion's sake. A teenager rebels because a rule exists. A grown man questions whether the rule still serves its purpose. Bruce's strength in this story is not that he ignores the uniform, it is that he makes everyone remember what the uniform was supposed to produce. Pike's strength is that he does not run from the correction. He feels the sting, protects his dignity, then speaks a better sentence to his students than the one he entered the room carrying. That is not weakness. That is leadership under pressure. A weaker man would have defended the cloth and lost the lesson. The young student would remember the day differently as he grew older. At 13, he might remember the strange man without a uniform. At 20, he might remember the exchange. At 40, he might finally understand the chair, the folded jacket waiting for a man who already knew who he was. That is the kind of image adults keep. Not because it is flashy, but because it speaks to every room where men are asked to trade authenticity for acceptance. Sometimes the trade is necessary, sometimes it is cowardice. The hard part is knowing the difference and having the spine to pay the price when dignity says no. Bruce paid that price calmly. He accepted the room's judgment without letting it define him. That is self-respect, not arrogance. Arrogance demands that everyone agree with you. Self-respect allows people to misunderstand you while you continue behaving according to your standard. By the end, even Clark understood that the problem had never been the clothing policy alone. The deeper problem was the comfort of judging a man before contact. Clothing had made that judgment easy. Bruce made the judgment expensive. Once the room paid the price, it became less eager to spend assumptions cheaply again. The next year, the showcase still required proper attire. But Clark added one sentence before the demonstrations began. The uniform is a sign of respect, not a replacement for it. That line may sound small, but small lines can carry entire afternoons when they are written by experience. Pike stood in the audience that year and heard the sentence without flinching. His students stood straighter. Some knew why the line had been added. Others only felt that it mattered. Good traditions often carry lessons forward without explaining every scar that gave birth to them. Bruce was not there the next year. He did not need to be. That is how real influence works. It does not require permanent presence. It changes the standard and leaves people responsible for maintaining it. A man who needs to be worshipped has followers. A man who changes standards leaves adults with work. That work is the heart of the story. Wear the uniform if the room requires it. Respect the room if the room has earned respect. But never let a room convince you that its approval is the same as your dignity. Approval can be borrowed. Dignity has to be carried. Bruce Lee walked into the ring without a uniform and changed the rules because he showed the difference between borrowed dignity and carried dignity. The white jacket on the chair was clean, formal, and correct. Bruce's conduct was cleaner. That is why, after he left, the jacket finally meant more than it had before.